Good afternoon to everyone. I know we'd all prefer to gather in person. I certainly would, but I'm pleased to be here among friends and to share some of my thoughts on the U.S. Nordic security cooperation and the evolving security environment. This event could not come at a better or perhaps a more consequential time. Perhaps at no point in history has the world been more interconnected and faced so many serious and exacerbating challenges. As we meet today, governments around the world continue to grapple with a deadly pandemic that has already claimed the lives of over 4.5 million people. And at the same time, climate change has accelerated, with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently concluding that we're quickly approaching the point of no return. And amid these global calamities, both Russia and China are aggressively seeking to reshape the international system in their own image. These three disparate events, the global pandemic, a warming climate, and a renewed great power competition, reveal the downside of an interconnected world and, I would say, the necessity of a shared response among our nations. The question then is, what is America's role in the world moving forward? And what are the implications for the future of the U.S. Nordic security cooperation? The United States has long wrestled with its place in the world, sometimes embracing it as its role as a global leader and other times shunning it. While the U.S. has occasionally turned inward and put America first, experience has shown time and time again that the U.S. is better off, our allies and partners are better off, and indeed, I think the world's better off when the U.S. chooses to lead with humility and a close collaboration with them. The fact is, we need each other as never before. It will require all of us working together to meet today's challenges. As Secretary Antony Blinken stated in his first major speech after assuming the role of the U.S. Secretary of State, quote, "Not a single global challenge can be met by any one nation acting alone, not even one as powerful as the United States. And there is no wall high enough or strong enough to hold back the changes transforming our world," end quote. As we enter this new era of great power competition, it's essential the U.S. reset, re-engage, and restore trust with our allies and partners, particularly our Nordic partners. As you well know, the High North is fast becoming a competitive frontier in the great power competition. As climate change opens new maritime routes and economic opportunities in the Arctic, Russia has been the first mover to establish a dominant military position in the region. They've deployed advanced air defenses, improved submarines, interceptor aircraft, and offensive tactical weapons. They've claimed more of the Arctic seabed, reconstructed a network of Cold War-era military bases, and rapidly expanded their fleet of icebreakers. In recent years, Russia has conducted persistent influence campaigns to undermine Western governments and institutions. These hybrid activities include interference in foreign elections, espionage, disinformation to heighten social issues and tensions, and cyber infiltration of critical infrastructure. It has carried out targeted assassinations to silence opposition leaders and critics. And of course, it's attacked neighboring countries, annexed territory, and supported proxy forces to maintain control over its near abroad. None of these tactics are new, but despite our warning, Russia has grown much more adept and brazen at using them to challenge the U.S. and its allies across multiple domains, both civilian and military, I would add. And given their success, we can expect them to continue to press every advantage in the Nordic region. We must focus and work together to counter this Russian-type war, this hybrid warfare. Clearly, the importance of the Arctic is growing, and the U.S. continues to view the Nordic countries as trusted partners in the region and an important counterbalance to Russia along the northern flank. The Nordic countries have served and continue to serve as a democratic bulwark against Russia's authoritarian expansion. This includes not only security interests, but also the maintenance of exclusive economic zones for resource exploration, freedom of navigation in Arctic airspace and international waters, and conservation and protection of the environment. The Department of Defense's Arctic strategy makes clear that the U.S. is committed to ensuring, quote, "a secure and stable region in which the U.S. national security interests are safeguarded, the U.S. homeland is defended, and the nations work cooperatively to address shared challenges," end quote. And this commitment extends beyond rhetoric, in my opinion. In recent years, the Arctic has become a focal point for U.S. defense planning and resource allocation. The U.S. Department of Defense and each one of the service branches now has an Arctic strategy. Each of our military services, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, are training and regaining capabilities to operate in this challenging environment. And the U.S. government has increased funding for icebreakers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, and other cold weather capabilities. Important steps have also been taken in military cooperation between the U.S. and the Nordic countries. For example, in 2018, the U.S. has reestablished the Navy's Second Fleet to patrol the North Atlantic and provide the core for the NATO Joint Force Command Norfolk. The U.S. Marine Corps has pre-positioned military equipment in the region and regularly deploys there for training, most recently in January 2021. We're reinforcing air and naval capabilities in the North Atlantic. The U.S. has also signed bilateral defense cooperation agreements with Sweden and Finland in 2016, and a tripartite statement reinforcing this commitment in 2018. In March this year, B-1 bombers deployed to Orland Air Base in Norway for exercises in the region. This fall, the U.S. will establish its first permanently based F-35 squadron in Europe, the first of 450 F-35 aircraft to be based in Europe by 2030, making it the largest fighter force in Europe. More broadly, President Biden has halted and reversed the prior administration's decision to reduce our forces in Europe, and the U.S. Congress continues its strong bipartisan support for NATO and U.S. forces in Europe. Congress has supported the administration's FY22 request for another $3.7 billion for the European Deterrence Initiative, and has directed the Pentagon to report on whether additional U.S. forces in Europe are needed. So yes, the United States is increasing its focus on the Pacific and the dangers posed to global security by rising China, but we're not leaving Europe or the alliance. Cooperation between the U.S. and our Nordic partners is strong, but it can be stronger. As a former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, I cannot overstate the importance of diplomatic, informational, and economic cooperation in confronting mutual threats, whether it be climate change, COVID-19, or the renewed challenges from Russia. All these challenges require a total defense concept, and we must work collaboratively with this in mind. Just as Russia has mounted a coordinated hybrid campaign to pursue its revisionist goals, the Nordic countries must be prepared to mobilize all elements of national power to deter and resist them. Hybrid threats require a whole-of-government approach that moves beyond conventional military activities and encompasses both military and civilian capabilities. This is especially true in responding to unconventional actions such as information operations, economic coercion, and cyber attacks that fall short of traditional armed conflict, but can be just as damaging. In the face of a significant security challenge and domestic budgetary constraints, we must allocate and manage resources as efficiently as possible as well. We must work collaboratively in research and development of emerging technologies, space, and cyber. And together in these dynamic domains, we can leverage our combined resources and maintain our edge efficiently. We must reinforce multilateralism. I'm convinced it's the only way to counter Russia and China's assault on the international rules-based order and our shared values. Today's challenges are too great, the stakes too high, for any one country to manage them on their own, or worse yet, try to insulate themselves from the international community. It simply can't be done, and we must instead deepen our engagements with our international partners and double down on institutions that, despite the growing pains, have led to a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity in Europe. We must continue to support and adapt institutions like NATO, the EU, and the Nordic Defense Cooperation to be relevant to these emerging threats and technologies, and to promote closer defense cooperation between the U.S. and countries in the High North. Now, this includes increased information sharing, breaking down the barriers and setting the priority to share information rather than protect it. Additional frequent and substantial bilateral, multilateral training and exercises to hone the skills needed in conflict and which simultaneously deter Russia, and continuing to modernize our forces with enhanced capabilities based on emerging technologies with a bias, with a bias toward interoperability. Increased intelligence cooperation is essential to developing an accurate threat picture in the region. While the U.S. has presence in the Arctic, the truth is no one knows the environment better than the Nordic countries. And the U.S. will continue to rely on this domain awareness and cooperation with you to strengthen our collective defense. Norway's procurement of a P-8 surveillance aircraft is an excellent example of how countries' capabilities can contribute to increased readiness for all. Finland's diligent watch along the 1,300-kilometer border with Russia and the enhanced and expanded defense cooperation between Sweden, Finland, and the alliance are significant contributions to our common security. And I hope that we will continue to expand and deepen our work together for our mutual benefit. The U.S. and the Nordic countries must also continue to engage in joint training and exercises in the region, such as the Arctic Challenge, Cold Response, and Trident Juncture exercises. These activities build trust and enhance interoperability between forces, and they also demonstrate unity of effort and send a powerful message to our adversaries. And of course, we must continue to improve our capabilities in every domain. Defense investments should focus on increasing interoperability with U.S. and NATO weapon systems to ensure agility and speed in the event of conflict. For the U.S., this means, among other things, more funding for U.S. Coast Guard icebreakers, ice-capable Navy surface ships, and the deployment of greater anti-submarine warfare capabilities. There are also opportunities across other domains, such as air and missile defense. For example, Norway and Denmark's procurement of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter are positive developments that will provide important capabilities for the coming decades. Now, as we say in America, talk is cheap. It's easy for me to sit here and talk about how the U.S. is ready to re-engage with our allies and partners and the growing importance of the Arctic region, especially now that I'm retired. But I believe what I've said is supported by U.S. administration's actions in Europe, particularly in the high north, and by their investments in defense. But today I also recognize that following the events in Afghanistan, the U.S. is suffering from a trust deficit. After the withdrawal of the American forces and the subsequent collapse of the Afghan government, some are once again questioning America's credibility, and I think understandably so. Despite what occurred in Afghanistan, the U.S. will continue to engage with our allies and partners in Europe to defend our values and common security. And I hope it will do so with humility and an ear for our allies' interests. I believe that Europe and the Nordic countries are and will remain an integral and important priority in U.S. foreign policy moving forward. In his inaugural address, President Biden pledged to, quote, repair our alliances and engage with the world once again, not to meet yesterday's challenges, but today's and tomorrow's, end quote. His priorities include the global challenges of climate change, the COVID pandemic, as well as mounting security challenges from Russia and China. I know the events in Afghanistan are still raw, and our enemies are already seeking to use them to drive a wedge between us. But I urge our partners to keep the faith. The U.S., for all its faults, is still a force for good and will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies to control the pandemic, tackle the threat of climate change, and deter Russian aggression in whatever form it may take. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed over 75 years ago under very different circumstances, but the values enshrined in it to safeguard freedom, democracy, rule of law, promote stability and well-being in North Atlantic, and to provide for the collective defense, these are just as relevant today, and they're still worth fighting for. It's been my experience, as the SACEUR in particular, that the Nordic nations embrace these values and act with integrity. The Nordic nations and the U.S. are truly better together, and overcoming today's challenges requires nothing less. Thanks for this opportunity to speak, for your time today, and for your friendship. And I look forward to answer your questions a bit later. Thank you. And Charlie, back to you.
Thank you. I think that was a great scene setter. And I wasn't going to give a comment here in between, but I think having followed both Nordic as well as U.S. discussions regarding the events in Afghanistan the last few weeks, what seems to shine through to me is that people recognize that there's an effort to do good and that the United States is the only country on the planet, they actually could provide the framework for all this action. That may not always have been the tone in U.S. domestic writings, but it seems quite clear that, as you said, the U.S. is still a force for good and tries to do things well. Now, time for our 4 Nordic responses. The first one is going to be by Pia Hansson. She's the director of our Icelandic sister institute, if one could call it, the Institute of International Affairs in Iceland. And just like the other panelists, she has a research background and expertise, but also has seen the policy on the ground side, because she was the head spokesperson for the Sri Lanka monitoring mission in 2007-2008. But with those words, Pia, how does it look from the Icelandic perspective?
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you as well to the keynote speaker for a very interesting start of this seminar. The perspective from Iceland is always a little bit different, I'd say, and let's maybe stress, if I may, to begin with, perhaps the uniqueness of being a small state, a Nordic small state, without a military. That's something that I always have to put out there. I know that you all know this, but let's nonetheless address it. And I think that for any discussion on what kind of choices Iceland makes for its security or cooperation, this is something that we need to keep in mind. When I talk about uniqueness in this, it's kind of resonates a little bit because you hear this from most of the Nordic countries. They all will claim to have a unique and special relationship with the US, right? I think we've all heard this before. This can be based on different things. I think that Iceland's uniqueness in this is, of course, the geopolitical and the geographic importance of Iceland during the Cold War and the shelter that was provided by the US and still is being provided by the US for Iceland. I would also like to maybe stress then that what was for a long time a kind of shelter relationship that maybe made us a little bit complacent, maybe also made us a little bit lazy in thinking more about what we want for our own security arrangements. I think that in a sense, when the US departed in 2006, what actually, of course, was to many a difficult situation, and even some felt this to be some sort of a betrayal, if I take it all the way to that. I think that in the end, what happened then was a certain coming of age to the debate on security issues in Iceland. And I think that this has led, perhaps, to a time of further self-awareness and looking at the issue from our own perspective and trying to figure out our best way forward. So in that sense, I think it has been highly productive for Iceland. Of course, this does not mean that the US is still not providing us with defense and security, because certainly we have our bilateral defense agreement with the US, and we rely to a great extent on that. As the foundation, our NATO membership is still very firmly in place. But what happened then was nonetheless, there was a need to extend. There was a need to establish further and stronger agreements with our neighbors, and that has been done. And I think it has been very good for Iceland to go through this and to actually have to talk to our Nordic neighbors, for example, and others to further fill in the gap, if you'd like. Now, of course, the renewed interest in the region is something of concern. Of course, it's concern because we're not happy about increased militarization of the Arctic region. But at the same time, it has provided the Icelandic government perhaps also with the opportunity of finding maybe a new position, if you'd like, that we actually are trying to thread a very delicate balance between great power interests coming back in the region, new players also entering the region, and then what can we do? What do we have that might actually provide some strength to the discussion on this? I think that it's been interesting to see, for example, the renewed interest by the US that was also quite apparent in the former administration, where we had visits here from former State Secretary Pompeo and also Vice President Pence, where there were some very clear messages out loud on what was going on in the region and how perhaps Iceland should behave. I think that there might be a possibility in this for Iceland to form a sort of a new position, perhaps as a bit of a peace broker between the big powers in the region. We're not going to be contributing much when we talk about defense issues in any case, so this might be an opportunity for us. The commitment is, of course, very strong from Iceland to maintain peace, stability, and constructive cooperation in the Arctic. I think this also comes at a good time after Iceland has just finished its chairmanship of the Arctic Council, where, interestingly enough, the first bilateral meeting between US and Russia high-level diplomats occurred when Blinken and Lavrov met here in Reykjavik in May. So these things kind of can tie together for, I think, a sort of a niche for Iceland, the possibility to actually participate to a deeper level on discussions on security in the region. I can also say that everything that is happening now in the world, when we look at the pandemic and when we start to think about the possibilities of cooperation, we have to be very firm on who are our friends and who we're going to work with. For example, the discussion here in Iceland has been quite a bit on what's happening with Nordic cooperation in that area. So I think that that opens up an interesting train of thought as well. How can we firmly establish our collaboration when we are facing such different kinds of threats and different kinds of challenges? The same thing, of course, goes with hybrid activities, and the possibility here for Iceland to actually be on the same level in any kind of cooperation, I think is very important for us to be looking at, and certainly a level, an issue that is of high importance to the Icelandic government. I don't think I'll say much more right now. I just leave it out there and look forward to further discussions and questions and comments from you all.
Great, thank you, Pia. I already have some questions. There's a potential for competition between Iceland and Finland on some issues. But to the next panelist, Janne Haaland Matlari, she's a professor at the University of Oslo, but also Norwegian National Defense University. And like Pia, has experience from the policymaking side, as it were. She was a state secretary from 1997 to 2000. Foreign affairs. So, Janne, please take it away. Let's hear the Norwegian perspective.
Yes, thank you very much, and greetings from Oslo. We have what we call Indian summer. I don't know whether that's politically incorrect to say these days, but it's fairly hot here. And I just had my son, who is a military officer in the High North, visiting, and he is trying to build a tripwire defense in Finnmark. So he's an army fellow, and we're discussing the concept of how to defend the High North. Should it be based on missile technology? Should it be based on a tripwire presence? They're building a new mechanized battalion in Porsangmoen, which is probably the northernmost garrison in the world. And should one really sort of look at the old bastion defense concept of the Russians, or should one think that things won't happen that way anymore? So there are very interesting, not only tactical, but also technological issues involved in any discussion about common strategy. Norway, of course, is a key country. It's like an island looking, when we look westward, to the Atlantic. So we have a primary concern with the High North, the Barents, the whole GIUK problem of free passage of the North Atlantic, and of course the the issue of how to plan and work together with the other Nordics. Sorry, like General Scaparotti, I'm here stopping my telephone. So what I would like to say some words about is, I think, the need for strategy in Europe. Now we had a bit of a cold shower with President Biden's talk yesterday, where he talked about only vital American interests will get any involvement on the part of the Americans. Also the sort of seemed to be a continuation of the policy line of President Trump in that regard. However, the devil is in the details. So how one defines vital national interest is, of course, of vital importance in this regard. President Biden's underlining of the importance of democracies, maintaining and defending democracies, even talking about the League of Democracies, I think is significant. NATO remains the foremost alliance in that regard, also for the time ahead, I believe. But I think this was a good sort of reminder to the Europeans that we have to do more and we have to take defense seriously, because that's not the case in many capitals in Europe. I'm not as polite as the general. He has been SACEUR for a long time, so he knows exactly how one must put one's sort of emphasis. And clearly, there is a will and an interest in the continuation of NATO and in cooperation here in Europe, but the spending is too low, and the political, should one say, ability for statecraft is not very high. We just published a book, Rob Johnson in Oxford and myself, earlier this year, or in fact late last year, Military Strategy for the 21st Century, with the subtitle The Challenge for NATO, where we examine the strategic challenges, technology and national strategies. And of course, any military cooperation, any sort of security policy must start with strategic determination in a way. One must say that certain things are more important than others. That is making strategy. And it seems that in a way, we are very reactive. Very often the Europeans are very reactive. The Russians are very proactive. The Russians act what I would, as a scholar, I would say it's a maximalist strategy of negotiation. As a mother, I would quote my youngest daughter when she was little, and she said, "Give me an ice cream now and I will not start to scream." And then you're very tempted to give this ice cream, of course. And this is the sort of Russian approach. We want 150%, but if you give us 75%, we will maybe be nice and content. So there is a big difference here in the liberal democratic, should one say, pluralism of decision making, the safeguarding of any interest, the messiness of the political process, and autocratic regimes' ability to put priority on certain things and follow through. And that's, by the way, quite relevant for the whole of government approach needed in sub-Article 5 situations or political warfare. So I think we, in a way, the Europeans should be able to act and think strategically and then act strategically now and not wait for things to happen, not be reactive. Because if we continue to be reactive, we're always too late and it's too little in a way. And we lose that edge that we really need. I don't see any difficulty in sort of organizational membership. The fact that Finland and Sweden are not yet in NATO or won't be in NATO doesn't really matter so much. The host nation support agreement that you have is, as I often tell journalists, is like a passive NATO membership. Passive in the sense that nothing happens in peacetime, and it's sort of status-wise, it's the same as before. But in a crisis, an exercise and so on, NATO will be using the domains of these countries, the sovereign domains, so to speak. So you are integrated with NATO countries more increasingly, and you're integrated with certain countries, the US, JEF, the British-led intervention brigade. You're more and more inserting yourself, and we are cooperating in the NORDEFCO and so on. So the possibilities of cooperation are quite limitless, I believe. It's not so much the formality, but what we need in Europe is a much greater agreement on strategic priorities. And of course, there's a northern priority, that's Russia, and there's a southern, that is the Maghreb, migration, terrorism, etc. So that's where France has its key role. But that doesn't. The reality is that there are several priorities: Russia and terrorism, etc. But we must be much clearer about priorities, and then move to much more military integration, not only cooperation. Because the cost factor, even if we increase the budgets nominally, the cost factor is a reality that it will bring us down to critical mass for many capabilities quite quickly, unless we do something. For the High North, which was emphasized here, well, Norway is certainly extremely preoccupied by the High North, and we see that in a way, Russia cooperates, but at the same time, there is jamming of civilian aircraft around Finnmark. There have been 2 cyber attacks on the Norwegian Parliament last year. I mean, just for the pluralism of it, one was Chinese, one was Russian. There is this one isn't content with the status quo, clearly, in Moscow. There is testing of the waters. So political warfare, which is usually the term I prefer for sort of sub-Article 5 or hybrid, political warfare is a reality. So we may not like it or do not want to realize it, but we are in a political warfare with on several fronts. One is Russia, another is China. Then we have more local conflicts about important principles like the gunboat diplomacy in the Gulf and so on. So I think for Europeans, it's really high time to take more responsibility in this situation, not to, in a way, lean on the US to take the lead all the time. Although we hope, of course, that the US will be fully involved. But I would like to end by quoting or by agreeing with Stephen Walt, a colleague whom you know his writings undoubtedly. He just wrote in Foreign Policy that maybe US troops should be moved out of Europe, just to underscore to the Europeans that they have to take more responsibility for strategic action, thinking and action themselves. Now, I don't agree with pulling out the troops, but I agree with the analysis he makes that it's very convenient to, in a way, continue to always expect the US to be in the lead on every issue. And that's not sound, because states pursue different interests, and that's what Biden was saying, national interests. And there's nothing wrong in pursuing national interests. What else would one be pursuing? And there's a duty even to do so for a country. So I really think we must be more of not equal partners. That's too much in a way for the short term, but Europeans must step up considerably, and there will undoubtedly be much more military cooperation and even integration in the time ahead among Europeans at least, but also with the US. And as was mentioned, the P-8, the F-35, other capabilities, they are much more, it's very important to continue this kind of integration cooperation. And I hope from a strategic perspective, with a strategy behind it, not as a bottom-up procurement necessity. So I won't take more of your time now and look forward to the continued discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Janne. I have, again, so many questions for you. And I'm sure we now have a new term in Finnish domestic policy debates, passive NATO membership. I look forward to seeing and hearing that elsewhere. But next up, we have Robert Dahlsjö. He's a director, research director at FOI. He served also at the Ministry of Defense, as well as in the Swedish NATO delegation. And he is an active reserve officer, as maybe a few other people here on this panel. So, Robert, let's hear what the Swedish perspective, or I suspect we may hear a perspective which may be slightly more critical than the official Swedish perspective. Take it away.
I speak for myself, not for the Swedish government. So this will be a Swedish view, not the Swedish view. And Charlie asked us to do a run through of first official policy and then where we think policy is going and should go. And to begin with, the government stance, you might say that the Swedish government, like almost all governments in the Nordic-Baltic region, kept a poker face during the turbulent Trump administration. And with the Trump administration, of course, sowed severe doubts about the depth and future of the American commitment to Europe's security, as well as about broader transatlantic relations, trade, etc. And when asked publicly, the Swedish Minister of Defense basically said, we have relations with countries, not with individuals, and we expect the US to honor the agreements we have made. And that our MOD had excellent relations with the DOD under Jim Mattis helped to calm fears. And some people said privately, like they have done in other countries around the Baltic Sea, don't pay too much attention to what Trump says, look at what the Pentagon does. And against this background, the Swedish government has not so much expressed relief that Trump is gone from the White House and that Biden has declared that America is back, but they have discreetly welcomed the fact that America has confirmed and renewed its commitment to Europe and to the Nordic and Baltic region. And they look forward to cooperate, etc. Now, if we move to behind the scenes, first of all, I must say that rather few people in Swedish public life realize that the peace, security, and affluence made possible during the post-war years is not a natural state of affairs. That this is contingent on an American security guarantee for Europe, including Sweden, and that America continues to uphold the global post-war order, nowadays often called liberal. And neither do they realize that if America withdrew from world affairs and minded its own business, the world, including our region, would be a much harsher and colder place. I'd say that the Trump presidency has sensitized people to that the American commitment might change, but they haven't fully realized the consequences should this happen. And among the fairly few in, say, government and administration who realize this, the dominant mood has still been psychological denial and reaffirmment of the faith. No, this can't happen. America won't turn its back on us. Perish the thought. And that is despite the fact that Sweden would be particularly vulnerable to US withdrawal, as we went all in about eternal peace having broken out after the collapse of communism, as we have long neglected our own defenses, despite living in a rough neighborhood, and as we have attempted to square the circle after Crimea by mooching on America's strength despite not being members of NATO. And you might say in political terms, the latter point is in the internal Swedish debate often referred to as a Hultqvist doctrine after the Minister of Defense who is the man behind this. And this has in many ways been brilliant, because for domestic political reasons, Sweden joining NATO would have a political cost. The same with Finland. So Hultqvist has found a way of enjoying the benefits of NATO membership without paying the political price. And that is bypassing Brussels, going directly on Washington, D.C., and building up bilateral ties. And then with Finland, trilateral ties. And this, of course, has a beauty to it, but it's also much more vulnerable to the vagaries of the White House. Because if you remember, then at least you are part of a bigger crowd, a bigger group. While if you're depending on informal guarantees, they might be negated as easily as they were made. So there has been a discussion in Sweden over a plan B, in part because I raised the issue about a year and a half ago. Shouldn't we start thinking of a plan B in case the transatlantic link breaks? And there has been some discussion, but not in the say at the top level. And when we have looked at the possible candidates for a plan B, should America retreat into its shell, and there is, after all, a new presidential election in a little more than 3 years, there are really no good alternatives. The EU was built in the lee of NATO and is a thoroughly postmodern entity, which cannot, which couldn't fight its way out of a wet paper bag. And I've presented my view on these alternatives in a fairly recent blog post on the Wavell Room called "No Europe Can't Fend for Itself," and you can see there. The UK is everybody's favorite in Scandinavia. The Brits are so likable, we think, but they are also delusional. They've had their head in a Brexit sack for 5 years. Before that, they lived in a Cameronian world where everybody was friends. Now they think it's an enormous step forward that they have realized that there is competition with China and Russia, but they still don't believe in actual war. So their military is run down, and what money they have, they're spending for a glory project of a presence in the Far East. If you look to Germany, it's just a basket case. In many ways, it's very good. It's politically stable, it's economically sound, etc. But when it comes to security politics, America neutered Germany very effectively after 1945, and it shows. And there's a recent Adelphi paper out from IISS written in frustration over German political culture, and I can recommend it strongly. I'm reading it right now. So nobody trusts German security guarantees. And then there's France. France is militarily capable. It's not fuzzy about the use of force, but it also has its interest in another geographic direction, towards the Med and the Maghreb. So and they are given to occasional overtures to Russia, which is the main problem in our region. So there's really nobody's hand to hold if the Americans should withdraw, except each other's. And then we have the fact that we are on our way, that America is moving to Asia. And Mike Scaparrotti told us that we will be shifting to Asia, but we will not be leaving Europe alone. Well, we'll see. There will be a shift of attention, and Europeans will have to get much more serious about their own defense and their own security. So what should we do? Or to quote Lenin, "Что делать?" We should build up our defenses. I would say for Sweden, double. plus build out host nation support, and we can easily afford it. We should make society more resilient. We can afford that too. And as we are entering a new Cold War with China, the demands in Europe will not be primarily military terms, but they will be in economic and technological terms. That we need to get in line with about trade and technology, reduce dependence on China, although it will hurt and cost, and we should put pressure on the Germans to do likewise. And finally, we need to brace ourselves for a new nuclear race, because I think that's the coming big issue. The Chinese are building new silos for ICBMs, and it looks like they are they're doing a breakout from the cocoon on minimum deterrence that they've been in since the 1960s, and they're going for parity with Russia and America in strategic arms. And that will have enormous effects, not only on the likes of India and Pakistan, and it will bring the nuclear issues to our front pages. On that happy note, thank you.
On that happy note, indeed. Thank you, Robert. I am sure that you will get many contacts from embassies trying to explain how things are much better and rosier than you painted. So thank you for that. And final panelist is our very own Peter Piirainen, who's now a visiting senior fellow at FIA, but his day job as it is at the Ministry of Defense. But like the other panelists, he has experience in going to different places. Brussels, representing Finland in Brussels, as well as in Washington, D.C. And as a side note, I have apparently agreed with his bosses that he's free to say almost anything and return to his job after his visit. But Peter, take it away.
Hi, thank you, Charlie. And greetings from Helsinki to everyone. Today, I decided to say a few words about Finland and US, then take a look at what does Nordic-US security cooperation look like, and lastly make a few remarks about how our cooperation might evolve. But let's start. Like Pia said, each Nordic country is unique, and we all have a unique relationship with the US. So I'm going to start by saying a few remarks about Finland and the US. I have one example why Finland and US are similar, and one example why we are different. And the example why we are so similar is that we both believe that we are exceptional. We all know the US slogan, shining city upon a hill, and US being example for others. But for Finnish case, there's also reason why we believe we are exceptional, and that's that we believe that Finland is different. Many times we find that what is suitable for others is not suitable for Finland, and the reasoning is that because Finland is different. The example why Finland and US are different has to do with how we talk about defense and military. The decision-making cycle in Washington is goes something like first. In Washington, they realized that world is changing and US must adapt. They also realized that defense and military needs to transform. Washington states that we are not there yet, but that we are working on it and we will get there, and so they do, and so they have every time. In Finland, the decision-making cycle goes a little bit differently. We noticed that the world has changed, and then we come to the conclusion that our defense solution is fit for new times. and we don't need to change. We will stick with military conscription. We will need large reserve, and Finland will remain outside military alliances, but want to keep the NATO door still open. Okay, so let's move next to what does Nordic-US security cooperation look like at the moment. I think today our defense cooperation between US and the Nordics is closer than it has ever been. In order to understand what Nordic-US defense cooperation looks like, we must look at how Russian invasion of Ukraine changed the security environment and the nature of defense cooperation. And in my view, the lesson learned after 2014 was that when it comes to defense in the Baltic Sea region, we all, including US, must cooperate even though there are no treaty obligations or guarantees. So defense cooperation today is based on common overlapping security interests, like the title of this seminar states. Okay, we can now move forward and take a look at how our cooperation might evolve in the future. In my view, during the Obama and Trump presidency, we found overlapping security interests, and I have no doubt that we will find them during the Biden presidency as well, even though the international order is changing as well. Therefore, we might have to adjust the transatlantic agenda a little bit. During the Obama and Trump years, focus was on Russia, Baltic Sea, and traditional defense. And this was also strength of Finland. So this was, despite the uncertainty, Finland had its strengths. But during the Biden years, there's rise of great power competition, and this will dominate the thinking on both sides of the Atlantic. And we cannot focus purely on European security and defense anymore. New strategic documents are being drafted on both sides of the Atlantic. In Washington, they are drafting the national security strategy and national defense strategy. And on this side of the Atlantic, we are drafting the strategic compass. These official documents are not ready yet, but we can already make some remarks based on the discussion that is ongoing in Washington and in Europe. And first, I will take a look at the discussion in Washington. In August, 3 interesting articles by former civil servants from Obama and Trump administrations were released. And the first one was by Wes Mitchell. He published an article called "A Strategy for Avoiding Two-Front War in National Interest." And his main argument was that US must create incentives for Moscow to reorient its foreign policy, create obstacles to westward expansion, and create opportunities in the East. And the second article I would like to highlight is by Charles Kupchan. His article was in Foreign Affairs, The Right Way to Split China and Russia. And his main argument was that now is the time to begin sowing the seeds of a Chinese-Russia split. And the last article I'm going to mention is by Ben Rhodes. His article was in Foreign Affairs as well, called Them and Us. And he set a goal for US foreign policy, and it was set like this: organizing the world to combat climate change, strengthening global health system, and pivoting to Asia while trying to contain a revanchist Russia. I think what's common to all these articles is that rise of China is the new priority. The difference, on the other hand, is that while Mitchell and Kupchan believe that only a change of course is required, Ben Rhodes believes that structural correction and redesigning the ocean liner, as he describes it, is necessary. But I think what all these three articles lack is thinking about the role of partners and allies. And I think this is where Europeans and Nordics must help Washington to fill in the box. So let's finally take a look at the European debate, because I hope we can find the answers here. Europeans have started self-reflection in 2014, and the outcome of this self-reflection has been that Europe must be strategically autonomous. To keep my presentation short, I will only highlight 4 remarks about European strategic autonomy at this stage. The first point is that international order is changing. Europe must have a role of its own when we enter the era of great power competition. My second point is that Europe must continue to build European strategic autonomy. Only that way we can look after our own interest and become equal partner with the US. And my third point is that in the era of great power competition, Europe and the US will need each other. And finally, the new transatlantic agenda cannot rely so heavily on defense cooperation. We need other issues on the agenda, like health security, climate change, revitalization of democracy, trade, innovation, emerging technologies, and of course defense. But these items should form the new transatlantic agenda. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Te. We have about 15 more minutes of this panel. Thank you at this point already for all of the comments. We have 2 questions in the chat section. I'll read them out soon, but also I have questions for each one of your reflections. First one to Janne. You have spoken and written about the importance of history, and that perhaps people in history don't, or people in Europe don't quite have a good enough grasp of it. Do you think this has an impact of what we can expect in terms of cooperation, only within the Nordic countries, or then within the US? And for Pia, we had an earlier panel about the kind of Asia Indo-Pacific, and there the idea that came up that small, medium countries were being maybe forced into what was termed a false choice of having to choose between the US and China, with some having a very robust relationship militarily with the US, but a trade one with China. So I'd be curious to hear how Iceland views this, because I think there are probably some lessons for other Nordics. Robert, you've written about strategic cacophony in Northern Europe. And I wonder, you gave this great description of the major powers in Europe. Do you think the Nordics can kind of overcome this strategic cacophony for us, at least? And is there a risk of talking too warmly about how good it is that we're all holding hands and developing our capabilities? For Pete, Finnish policy is formally always stable and unchanging, but as you pointed out, it actually changes in practice very radically from one decade to the other. Do you think this has how do you think it'll look moving forward? We have a government defense white paper coming in and out in about a week exactly. I know you can't say anything about it, but some thoughts on that. And then finally, Curtis, you mentioned cyber, and you also mentioned in congressional testimony a few years ago of the importance within NATO and partners in Europe to work on both cyber as well as logistics. How do you see these having developed, and what are things that maybe could be done more in the Nordics? Since we've just heard that we have one actual island, Finland always considers itself to be an island. Norway was an island to the Atlantic. So we have lots of islands with logistics challenges. And then finally, I'll just quickly recap these questions. This one was from Leo Michel for General Scaparati. Has to do with Finnish-Swedish-US relations. So he said, as I understand, both Finland and Sweden have liaison officers at EUCOM HQ in Stuttgart. And the question is, would it be useful and practical for planning, exercise, and the potentially operational reasons to place a US EUCOM liaison officers in the Finnish and Swedish counterpart HQs? And then from Ian Anthony, I guess addressed to everyone, thinking about what is happening in Belarus, what is the threshold between what could be called muscular competition and conflict? And how will we know when we are in crisis that might cross that threshold? And how quickly would leaders recognize and react? And this also, I guess I should mention that both Norway and Finland had an experience with what I call the refugee proof of concept from our dear Eastern neighbor in 2015 and 2016 on this. I don't know who wants to be the first one to take up the questions. And for the audience, please type in any additional questions you have into the chat.
Can I be the first? Because actually,
please do.
Another engagement I have to run to quite soon. Very interesting question on the small and medium states. And I think that there are some lessons to be learned, certainly, in how Iceland has handled certain things. So let me say that as a small state, I think the pragmatic approach is something that we use all the time. And I think that that's kind of what has been the case, historically speaking, with our relationship with the US. Now, that being said, there has been a lot of concern of Chinese influence in Iceland, for example, and I think that that has been rebuffed and that the relationship with the US remains very firm there, that although there have been some attempts at perhaps making it sound as if we are more open to other actors entering Iceland, I think that this has been rebuffed to a sense. So I think that this is, of course, something that most small and medium-sized countries always have to deal with. You know, you have to be in the shelter of sun. But at the same time, practically every state in the world, when you compare them to the great states, are small states, right? So we don't always have to be so concerned about how utterly small we are. Maybe this is some sort of an answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Janne?
Yes, thank you very much. I think I got a gist of your question about history. I'm just publishing soon a book in Norway called The Battle for Democracy, and it's about the sort of postmodern challenges of identity politics, of polarization of politics, of the lack of any appreciation that political parties are about ideology, not about single issues. Sort of the lack of high quality in our democracy, so to speak. And I think here the education of the citizen is now almost completely lacking in our democracies. That includes the US as well, where you have really fierce battles about this. The nation is then a foreign concept. It's a negative concept. It is, like in communism, something to be combated, to be deleted if possible. And of course, national defense then becomes a culprit. So there's something very essential at stake in the West now, in Europe and the US, where we are supposed to be able to both define and defend democracies, when in fact there are such big problems in our states. And in my book, I conclude with a classical character formation program of the West, which has been around for some 3,000 years, which is really what is needed for citizens to be identifying as citizens of a national democracy, which doesn't preclude international cooperation, of course. So there's something very disturbing about it's accentuated by the identity politics tribalism, which also tries to penetrate the US military for the time being, which we see some aspects of here as well. Because you cannot, if you cannot have the equality of citizenship or the equality of being soldiers serving a nation, then the whole rationale for national defense is basically gone. So I think in a way there's something disturbing in the fact that we are not proud of being citizens of really quite excellent countries compared to many others. That patriotism is a problematic issue for many Europeans at least, and the lack of knowledge of history naturally explains a lot. The 1990s was, according to this famous American political scientist, the end of history. You remember the Francis Fukuyama's diagnosis, and of course that was not the end of history, but it was sort of the start of such a deep peace that lasted for 20-25 years. That a whole generation was just steeped in that as being the reality. And now it is really very different. China is a sort of abhorrent example of how one has an old totalitarian style system put in place with modern technology. And I wish that Europeans would be much more concerned about this and be very proud of what we have compared to such a political system. So I think that's this is something related to defense. We're thinking about doing something on this, some book or something with Rob Johnson, Oxford. Sort of the lack of strategic interest, the lack of interest in defense, the lack of sort of vigilance in being attacked so much by hybrid means must surely have something to do with this lack of realization that one is a responsible citizen, responsible for one's own country. So ideas about how to write about this are most welcome, because I think this is essential, but it's very difficult to sort of identify very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Janne. So yes, all ideas to Janne. We have a few minutes. I hope the audience and panel members don't mind if I go a few minutes over, simply so that everyone has a chance to respond. I'll throw in one question because in here still, because it has to do with Finland and Sweden. Whether or not there are any kind of specific military cooperation or military technical elements in Finland, Sweden, NATO cooperation that would substantially strengthen deterrence and defense. But with that, I will hand off. Curtis, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go. Thank you, Charlie. Whipping through these, I think a number of them I could address. The quickest is the question about liaison with EUCOM. You know, traditionally we look at our defense attaché as being that person within a country. They are directly linked into the EUCOM J5. They've got a direct line to the strategy folks in the headquarters. On the other hand, it's always better if you can have a liaison officer, and we have very close relationships among our nations there in Europe, in a working relationship. It's a matter of resource and priority, but it would always be better if we could do that. You know, there was a question about the threshold here, looking at Belarus. The point I'll make quickly is that we're dealing with adversaries in both Russia and then in competition with China who don't see the line that we talked about, and Jana, you mentioned, between conventional and hybrid. It's not a part of their thinking in this dynamic, and we continually think that way. So the position of forces in Belarus, the position of forces off the border of Ukraine, that they've left most of it there since last April, that's part of this hybrid peace. And it is precisely to create the ambiguity that makes it difficult for us to decide when they're going to cross our line, right? So that's why we have to think strategically. I think we are much too reactive, and I think we do need to get back to strategy to do that. The question of logistics, we've done a lot in logistics in Europe. It's got some focus now. NATO's established a headquarters. The countries, including the UE, are beginning to invest, but there's so much more that needs to be done because our defense there depends on the ability to move quickly, the ability to supply a large force, and to do that with agility. And so the countries have to invest in the infrastructure that allows us to do that, and much of that still needs to be done. Cyber, again, we've made good progress. There are countries in Europe, in the north and two, that have very good cyber centers. The key in cyber is that it's dynamic, it's changing every day, and it's very challenging. And truly, in this area, this is where we're better together. Okay, better minds together, and we've got to be much closer in the cyber realm. My last point here is, this is much like intelligence, though. We tend to protect things and not share them. We've got to figure out means of sharing as a priority, because cyber requires that as well. I think I hit most of those. Did I get them, Charlie?
Yep, great, thank you. Understood. Peter, do you want to take off, and then Robert gets the last word, as it were?
Yeah, thank you. Finnish defense policy. On one hand, you could say that nothing has changed since the end of the Cold War, if you only look at Finland being outside NATO, but at the same time, I believe everything has changed. Early 1990s, when we started our cooperation with NATO, it was strictly limited to crisis management, and today we realize that if we want to defend Finland, we need to understand what is happening around us and what our partners are doing. And in a similar way, I think it's of great importance and interest to our partners also, what is Finland doing and when is Finland doing what it's doing. So even though there hasn't been a major shift in stated defense policy, I believe that the practice has changed quite dramatically. Thank you.
Thank you. And Robert.
Charlie, there was a word in your question to me which I didn't get. Strategic what?
Cacophony.
Ah,
written about this.
Okay.
Does it also apply to the Nordics?
Sometimes. Let me begin with that question briefly, and then I'll get into the Swedish-Finnish question. I think it makes sense for us Nordics to cooperate. If nothing else, because together as a somewhat coherent bloc, we are more interesting in the eyes of Washington and in the eyes of Brussels than if we all try to get our attention for our own country. And there's a great potential still to be had, but the national stovepipes are very real, and the national instincts are still very strong, and the different outlooks in different directions, they are still a reality. And also it behooves us to remember history, because in the 20s and 30s, the Nordics bought into this idea of the peace had broken out and the League of Nations. And then that was shown to be toothless around 35, 36. And then we retreated briefly into the idea of Nordic solidarity. But that only lasted a few years until it was tested for real. And then everything broke down and it was every man for himself. So we should keep that in mind. On the second question of Swedish-Finnish military cooperation, I think important things are already being done when it comes to air operations and the basing of aircraft, and that could be pushed further. There are great things to be gained there from the possibility of all three air forces operating from all three air bases. When it comes to new areas, I would suggest situational awareness, targeting, and long-range fires. That's a very common interest that we all in this region have, and we're all dependent on Big Brother across the sea. And the better we can get at making sure that something happens to somebody somewhere very fast and with precision, that would increase deterrence, I think. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you to the audience for following us, and especially a big thank you to panel. We have run about 5 minutes over, but I hope you don't mind. I think we could have continued this for a good many hours. With this, I close these summer sessions and this panel. Hope you have a good continued week. Thank you.